For 2 years, not a single doctor, therapist, or specialist could get Marine veteran Robert to even blink on command. He was mute, catatonic, locked inside a VA hospital room. Then a rookie school teacher, volunteering for the first time, leaned close and whispered a phrase she'd only ever heard from her late father. And the Marine who hadn't moved in 730 days stood up and saluted. This is the story of a breakthrough that defied every medical textbook, and the two broken people at its center. Robert was a decorated sergeant, shattered by an unseen wound no scan could detect. The teacher was just a civilian volunteer, carrying a grief of her own. Their collision in that sterile room would expose a terrifying truth about the wounds of war and the hidden keys that can sometimes, miraculously, unlock them. But to understand the moment that shocked an entire hospital, you have to understand the silence that came before. A silence 2 years deep. The silence began in a place called Sangin. Sergeant Robert Miller's unit was hit by a complex ambush in the Helmand province, an IED blast followed by sustained enemy fire. His squad made it out, but Robert didn't. Not all of him. Medics reported no major physical trauma, but from the moment of extraction, he stopped speaking. Completely. Back stateside at the Veterans Affairs Hospital, the diagnosis was severe, treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder with catatonic features. His body was present, his vital signs stable, but Robert was, for all clinical purposes, absent. He would sit motionless in a wheelchair by the window for hours, eyes open but unseeing, unaware. He required full care, feeding, bathing, everything. The medical term is stuporous catatonia. The human term is a living ghost. The VA threw everything at him. High-dose benzodiazepines, the first-line treatment for catatonia, did nothing. Dozens of sessions of cognitive processing therapy, a gold standard for PTSD, met a wall of silence. Specialists from neurology, psychiatry, even endocrinology were consulted. Scans showed a healthy brain, at least structurally. It was as if the man had simply decided to leave the building, locking the door behind him. As one resident's note frankly stated, patient represents a profound therapeutic impasse. He became a case study in the hallway, a reminder of the limits of modern military medicine. The staff, though compassionate, began to unconsciously speak around him as if he weren't there. His room was a tomb of quiet routines. 200 miles away, Sarah Bennett was navigating a different kind of silence. A first-year 5th grade teacher, she was still reeling from the sudden death of her father, a retired Marine Master Sergeant 8 months prior. He had been her anchor. His death from a heart attack was swift, leaving behind a house full of shadows and a daughter full of unasked questions. Grief counseling suggested finding a purposeful connection. On a community bulletin board, she saw a flyer for the VA's Companion Corps volunteer program. No medical experience needed, it read. Just a willingness to sit, to read, to be a consistent human presence. It felt like a sign. She applied, passed a background check, and attended a single 3-hour orientation. The coordinator was clear. You are not therapists. Do not try to be. You are a friendly face. Your job is presence, not cure. Sarah was assigned to the long-term neuropsychiatric wing. Her first walk down the corridor was a lesson in controlled chaos. The beep of monitors, the distant echo of a television, the low murmur of staff. Then she was led to room 14. The charge nurse, a weary woman named Gail, gave her a quick briefing. That's Robert. 2 years, no verbal or motor response to any stimulus. We turn him, we feed him, we keep him clean. Your job is to sit with him for an hour. You can read the paper, talk about your day. He won't react. Don't take it personally. Sarah pushed the door open. The room was stark. A bed, a chair, a small cabinet, an American flag hung in a frame in the corner, and by the window, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light, was Robert. He was younger than she expected, maybe mid-30s, but he looked carved from stone. His hands rested on the arms of his wheelchair, perfectly still. His gaze was fixed on a point in the middle distance, seeing nothing. Sarah's training evaporated. What do you say to a statue? She pulled a chair beside him, her heart pounding. She introduced herself, her voice sounding too bright, too false in the quiet. She talked about her classroom, about the rain that morning, about the book she was reading. Nothing, not a flicker. The silence in the room was a physical weight pressing down on her chatter. She felt foolish, then profoundly sad. This was a hero reduced to this. Her father's face flashed in her mind. He'd had buddies who came back changed, hollowed out. He'd rarely spoken of it, but when he did, his eyes went to that same distant place Robert was staring at now. Half an hour in, desperate to bridge the chasm, Sarah's mind scrabbled for a connection. Anything. She remembered the stories her dad would tell, not about war, but about the bizarre, dark humor of barracks life. The silly cadences sung on long marches, the weird slang, and then one phrase surfaced, clear as a bell. Her father had muttered it sometimes when something was finished, locked down, irreversible. He said it when he packed away his uniform for the last time. He'd even said it with a sad smile when they buried her grandmother. It was a battlefield phrase he told her once from a long time ago. It meant the mission was over, the perimeter was secure, and the watch was stood down. It was a phrase of finality and of relief. She had no idea what unit it was from or what it really signified. It was just a piece of her father, a fossil of a life she never knew. Looking at Robert's frozen profile, a desperate, irrational thought took hold. What if the door wasn't just locked? What if it was sealed with a code only another Marine would know? Sarah leaned forward, her mouth dry. She dropped her voice, not to a nurse's gentle tone, but to the low, firm register she'd heard her father use. She whispered the six-word phrase directly toward Robert's ear. For 3 seconds, nothing. Then Robert Miller's head turned. For the first time in 2 years, his eyes moved, focusing directly on her face. They were clear, aware, and filled with a storm of confusion and recognition. His right arm trembled. Slowly, with immense effort, as if fighting against rusted chains, he raised his hand to his brow in a sharp, perfect salute. The motion was deliberate, disciplined, and utterly devastating. Sarah stumbled back, her chair screeching on the floor. At that exact moment, the door swung open for a routine meds check. The aide froze, the pill cup crashing to the floor. In the frozen minute that followed, 3 things happened in rapid succession. The nursing aide sprinted down the hall shouting for Dr. Evans. Sarah Bennett stood rooted to the spot, her hand clamped over her mouth, staring at Robert, whose arm remained fixed in that salute, his eyes now searching her face with an intensity that was almost violent. And Robert Miller, for the first time in 730 days, began to cry. Silent tears cut tracks through the stubble on his cheeks. He did not make a sound. The neuropsychiatric wing of a VA hospital is not built for miracles. It is built for management. So when Dr. Aris Evans, the attending psychiatrist, burst into the room, his first reaction was not wonder, it was protocol. He moved quickly to Robert's side, speaking in low, calm tones. "Sergeant Miller, Robert, can you lower your hand for me?" Robert's eyes flickered toward the doctor's voice, but the salute held firm, his arm beginning to shake from the sustained exertion. Evans shot a glance at Sarah. "What did you do?" I just said something," Sarah stammered. "Something my father used to say." "What phrase?" She repeated it, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Evans's face went blank. It meant nothing to him. But to Robert, hearing it a second time, it acted like a key turning another lock. A shudder ran through his body. His arm dropped heavy into his lap. He let out a long, ragged breath that sounded like it had been held for 2 years, and then his eyes rolled back. He slumped in the wheelchair, unconscious, but his vitals, checked frantically by the arriving nurses, were stable. He had simply shut down again, but the door had been opened, however briefly. What followed was a controlled explosion of paperwork and phone calls. Sarah was escorted not to the volunteer lounge, but to a small, windowless administrative office. A hospital administrator and a patient advocate sat across from her, recording her statement. They were polite but clinical, their questions circling one point. Had she been trained by anyone? Had she used any therapeutic technique? Was she affiliated with any outside groups? The implication was clear. They were trying to rule out malpractice or worse, a stunt. Sarah, still trembling, could only repeat the truth. It was a phrase from her dead father. A Marine. That was all she knew. Meanwhile, Robert was transferred to the medical ICU for 24-hour observation. Catatonic patients who exhibit sudden, violent motor breakthroughs are at risk for self-injury or a dangerous condition called malignant catatonia, where the body's autonomic systems spiral out of control. They needed to be sure his body could handle the shock of being present, but the scans and blood work showed nothing new. The only change was on one EEG monitor, which now showed brief, sporadic bursts of activity in brain regions associated with memory and auditory processing. The lights, for the first time, were flickering in the dark house. By the next morning, the story was no longer contained. Hospital gossip is a faster network than any internet. A catatonic Marine saluting a civilian volunteer was the kind of story that refused to stay in a chart. A local news reporter, tipped off by a staff member's distant cousin, called the VA's public affairs office. The administration, caught off guard, issued a terse, no comment that only fueled speculation. Inside the hospital, a schism formed. The clinical staff, the doctors, the therapists, were cautiously optimistic but deeply skeptical. Spontaneous remissions happen, they cautioned. It could be a paradoxical drug reaction, a fleeting neurological event. The phrase was likely a coincidence, a trigger that accidentally mimicked a therapeutic stimulus. But the nursing staff, the aides, the people who had washed Robert's body and spoon-fed him for years, they saw something else. They saw a man who had come back for just a moment to acknowledge a sister-in-arms. To them, it wasn't science. It was a sign. This tension hung in the air of the ICU like static. Sarah was asked, not ordered, to return the next day. The request came from Dr. Evans himself. "He responded to you," he said over the phone, his voice weary. "I can't explain it. The ethics board is having a meeting that will probably last until next week. But clinically, I'd like you to try again, with supervision." Sarah agreed. She couldn't have stayed away if she'd wanted to. The image of Robert's tear-streaked face was burned into her mind. She needed to know what or who she had unlocked. The second session was in a larger therapy room, with Dr. Evans and a clinical psychologist observing behind a one-way mirror. Robert was in his wheelchair, back in his catatonic state, but there was a subtle difference. His posture was less rigid, his hands open in his lap rather than clenched. Sarah sat before him, her heart a drum in her chest. She spoke softly for 20 minutes about her father, about teaching, about anything. No response. Then, steeling herself, she leaned in and whispered the 6-word phrase again. "Nothing." She tried a third time, her voice breaking. Robert's finger twitched, just once. A tiny, almost imperceptible jerk of his right index finger. Behind the mirror, Dr. Evans leaned forward. "Did you see that?" "It's a myoclonic jerk, could be random," the psychologist murmured. "Or it could be a signal," Evans replied. He made a decision. He left the observation room and entered the therapy space. He crouched down beside Sarah. "We need to understand this phrase," he said quietly. "You said your father was a Marine. What was his name and unit?" Sarah gave her father's name, Master Sergeant Samuel Bennett. She gave his last known unit, a logistics battalion. Dr. Evans nodded, writing it down. But then Sarah remembered something else. "After he died, I found a small box in his things, with some old patches and a folded picture. The patch didn't match his uniform. It was just a black rectangle with a red numeral 7 on it. There was no unit name." Dr. Evans's pen stopped. He looked from Sarah to Robert. A cold logic was beginning to form. He left the room and made 2 calls. The first was to the VA's records department, requesting a deep dive on Robert Miller's full service history, not just the medical summary. The second was to a colleague at the Defense Personnel Records Center, a favor called in. He needed to know if a Samuel Bennett had ever been cross-attached or associated with a unit designation involving that numeral. The answers took 48 hours. They arrived in fragments, and each fragment changed the story. Robert Miller's records showed 3 years of standard service with a combat engineer battalion. Then, there was an 18-month period listed simply as Temporary Duty Assignment, Joint Task Force. The location was classified. The medical summary noted his catatonia began after extreme psychological trauma during a classified kinetic engagement. The words were a bureaucratic shield, but they screamed a truth. Robert had seen something off the books. The answer on Samuel Bennett was more cryptic. The records clerk told Dr. Evans, "The name appears in a cross-reference index for operational security clearances related to Joint Task Force activities in the late 2000s. The specific unit affiliation is redacted. The file has a flag on it, a family-only release flag. That meant the details could only be legally released to next of kin, to Sarah." Dr. Evans now faced an ethical mountain. He had a patient whose breakthrough was tied to a phrase from a man who might have been connected to his secretive, traumatic service. Unraveling this could be therapeutic. It could also be profoundly destructive, unearthing memories Robert's mind had walled off for survival. And he had a volunteer, a civilian, who held the key but was walking blindly into a minefield of classified military history. He called Sarah back in. He laid out what he could, which was little. "Your father's service may have intersected with Robert's in ways we can't see," he said. "That phrase, it might be more than a family saying. It might be an operational recall code or a unit-specific signal. If it is, using it is like plugging a voltage directly into his memory. We don't know what that could do." Sarah listened, the weight of it settling on her. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to make a choice," Dr. Evans said. "You can walk away now. What you've done may have already started a process we can continue with controlled therapy. Or, you can help us try to map the connection. But if we open this door, we can't control what walks through it, for him or for you." Sarah thought of her father's tired eyes. She thought of Robert's salute. This was no longer just about volunteering. It was about completing a circuit that had been left broken. "I'll help," she said. The plan was delicate. They would conduct supervised sessions, using the phrase as an anchor but paired with gradual exposure therapy. The goal was not to shock Robert awake, but to use the phrase as a safe bridge for him to begin, at his own pace, to process the trauma it was linked to. It was a gamble using an untrained volunteer as a primary stimulus, but she was the only key they had. The third session began this new protocol. Sarah would say the phrase once, then follow it with neutral, reassuring talk. They saw the finger twitch again. The fourth session, his foot shifted. The fifth session, as Sarah spoke about her father's love of old Western movies, Robert's lips moved. No sound came out, but the shape they formed was unmistakable. He mouthed a single word in sync with her story: "John." Sarah stopped, her blood running cold. John Wayne, her father's favorite. She hadn't mentioned that name. She looked at Dr. Evans through the mirror. He was already on the phone. That night the story broke online. A sanitized, dramatic version of it. "Miracle at the VA, Teacher's Whisper Wakes Catatonic Marine." It had all the hallmarks of a viral feel-good story, but it named no names, used no specific photos. Yet for those in the know, it was a beacon. In a suburb 3 states away, a man in his 50s, a former Marine Staff Sergeant, read the article. He saw the vague description of the phrase, a 6-word battlefield saying. He knew only one unit that used a 6-word recall, a unit that hadn't existed on paper for a decade, a unit he thought had been buried with its fallen. He picked up the phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. His first words were, "We have a problem. One of the ghosts is talking." And back at the VA, a different kind of visitor arrived. 2 men in unmarked suits, carrying credentials from the Department of Defense Office of Prepublication and Security Review. They didn't ask to see Robert. They asked to see Dr. Evans. And they asked one very specific, very quiet question. Who, exactly, is the civilian volunteer, and what precisely did she say? Dr. Evans met the 2 officials in a secure conference room, the kind usually reserved for disciplinary hearings. Their credentials identified them as from the DoD, but their demeanor was all intelligence community. Calm, polite, and utterly immovable. They didn't ask about Robert's health. They asked about operational security. The phrase the volunteer used, the lead official, who gave his name as Mr. Green, began. We need to verify its exact wording. And we need to understand its point of origin. Dr. Evans, feeling his professional territory invaded, pushed back. My concern is my patient's therapeutic progress. This phrase is part of a clinical breakthrough. Your patient's trauma may be the direct result of classified operations, Mr. Green replied evenly. The phrase is a potential security marker. Its dissemination, even in a therapeutic setting, could compromise ongoing protocols and personnel. They presented him with a non-disclosure agreement to sign on the spot, covering the phrase and any details about the volunteer's father. Evans refused. I can't sign away my ability to treat my patient with relevant information. The meeting ended in a tense stalemate, but as the officials left, Mr. Green turned at the door. The volunteer, Sarah Bennett, she should be made aware that pursuing this line of inquiry could lead to the revocation of her father's posthumous benefits and honors for falsification of service records. The threat was veiled but crystal clear. They weren't just protecting a secret. They were willing to dismantle a dead man's legacy to do it. Word of the visit spread through the hospital administration like a cold virus. Suddenly, the hospital director was involved. Legal was on the phone. The message was unambiguous: cooperate fully with the DoD inquiry. Patient privacy, it seemed, had limits when it brushed against national security. Dr. Evans was ordered to suspend all sessions involving the phrase and to provide the officials with a full copy of Sarah's volunteer file. He was cornered. He called Sarah, not to the hospital but to a coffee shop a mile away. He told her everything: the visit, the threat against her father's record. They're scared, Evans said, leaning forward. That phrase isn't just a saying, it's a lock, and you have the key to something they buried. Sarah felt a surge of anger cutting through her fear. My father was a Marine for 22 years. He earned every bit of that legacy. They don't get to take it from him. For the first time, her grief was overshadowed by a need for defense, for truth. What about Robert? She asked. They haven't asked to see him yet, but if they think he's becoming communicative, they might. And they could have him transferred to a military facility with a snap of their fingers. Evans looked at her, his professional resolve cracking. I think you should go home. This is getting too deep. But going home was no longer an option. The article online, though vague, had been seen. That night, Sarah received a Facebook message from an account with no photo. It read, "Your father served with mine in JTF-7. The phrase is watchtender's reprieve. Don't say it again, they're listening." The message was deleted 15 minutes later, but the name was burned into Sarah's mind. JTF-7, Joint Task Force 7. She searched it online. Nothing. No public record. No Wikipedia page. It was a ghost. Armed with a name, she went back to the box of her father's things. She emptied it on her living room floor. The black patch with the red 7, the folded picture she'd never really examined. It was a grainy, faded photo of 5 men in desert camouflage, not standard issue, with no unit patches visible. They were standing around a dusty, unmarked vehicle, smiling. One was her father, younger, thinner. Another man had his arm around her dad's shoulders. Sarah brought the photo close to the lamp. The face of that man, though younger, was unmistakable. It was Robert Miller. Her father and Robert had not just intersected. They had served together, side by side, in a unit that didn't exist. The next morning, she drove back to the VA. She didn't check in with volunteers. She went straight to Robert's new room in the step-down unit. A different aide was there. Sarah showed her the photo, pointing to Robert. "This was his friend, my father. I need to see if he recognizes it." The aide, moved by the raw plea, glanced down the hall and then nodded. 2 minutes. Sarah knelt before Robert. He was more alert than she'd ever seen him. His eyes tracked the light from the window. She held the photo up in his line of sight. "Robert," she whispered, "do you know these men?" His gaze drifted over the image. Nothing. Then slowly it focused. His breath hitched. A low, guttural sound, the first vocalization anyone had ever heard from him, emerged from his throat. It wasn't a word, it was a moan of pure anguish. His hand lifted, trembling violently, and his finger touched the face of the man with his arm around her father. Then his finger moved to her father's face. A single tear fell from his eye onto the photograph. He looked at Sarah, and in his eyes was a world of apology and shared horror. He knew. He remembered them all. The aide rushed in, hearing the sound. "You have to go now," she urged Sarah. As Sarah stood, Robert's hand shot out with surprising speed and grabbed her wrist. His grip was weak but desperate. He was trying to hold on to the one living connection to that buried past. He opened his mouth, his throat working. A rasping whisper, air over sandpaper, came out. One word: ambush. Then he let go, collapsing back into his chair, exhausted. The word hung in the air. Ambush. It confirmed everything and nothing. Sarah fled the room, the photo clutched in her hand. She knew now. Her father and Robert had been in something together, something that ended in an ambush. And that ambush was the source of Robert's prison of silence, and likely the reason for her father's own haunted quiet in his later years. Dr. Evans was livid when he found out she circumvented protocol, but the clinical result overrode his anger. Robert had spoken, a meaningful, contextual word. It was a monumental breakthrough, but the means of that breakthrough, the photograph, was a ticking clock. If the DOD was monitoring them, they would know the past was not just stirring, it was speaking. He made a decision. He called in a favor from a medical school friend who now worked at a major newspaper. He didn't give details, only a question. If a veteran was traumatized during a classified operation and the government was now interfering with his treatment to protect that classification, is that a story? The friend's answer was immediate. It's the story, but you'll need proof, and you'll need to be ready for war. Proof arrived from an unexpected direction. The former staff sergeant who had read the article, the one who'd made the panicked phone call, couldn't stay silent. His name was Frank Donnelly. He tracked Sarah down through a veterans network using her father's name. He called her, his voice gravelly with emotion and fear. "I served with your dad and Miller in JTF 7, he said. "The ambush, it wasn't the enemy. It was a setup. A friendly fire incident orchestrated to wipe us out because we saw something we shouldn't have. An unauthorized weapons transfer. Your dad and Miller, they were the only ones who physically saw the serial numbers. The rest of us just heard the intel. They took the full weight of it." He told her the operation's code name, Operation Sandglass. He gave her a date. And then he said the phrase, "Watchstander's reprieve." It was the abort signal. The command to stand down and exfiltrate because the mission was compromised from the inside. It was never broadcast that night, because the people who compromised it were the ones who were supposed to be receiving it. Sarah's world tilted. Her father hadn't just been in a unit with Robert. They had been witnesses to a crime, a betrayal by their own side. Their unit was sacrificed to cover it up. Robert's mind broke under the weight. Her father, he came home and lived with that knowledge for the rest of his life. The phrase wasn't just a recall. It was the warning that never came, the signal that would have saved them. Frank Donnelly agreed to meet, to give a sworn affidavit, but only if he had guarantees of protection. He was still terrified. Sarah and Dr. Evans now had a source, a corroborating witness, and a motive for the cover-up. They also had a patient whose therapy now had a horrifying, specific focus, processing a betrayal, not just trauma. Evans resumed sessions, but with a new, dangerous goal. Using the phrase and the photo, they would gently guide Robert to articulate the memory, to name the betrayal in a therapeutic setting. The theory was that speaking the truth, in a safe space, could finally diffuse its psychic power. It was the nuclear option of therapy. The next session, with Frank Donnelly on speakerphone from a secure line, Evans and Sarah sat with Robert. Frank's voice, shaky but clear, came through. "Hey Miller, it's Donnelly from the sandbox, from Sandglass." Robert's head jerked up at the code name. His eyes widened. Frank continued, "I'm gonna say the names, brother. The ones who weren't there by accident. The ones who set the coordinates." He listed 2 names, military contractors. names that meant nothing to Sarah but which made Robert begin to shake. Then Frank said, "The abort signal. It was Watchstander's reprieve. They never sent it. They left us there." Robert's mouth opened. A torrent of soundless words poured out, his face contorted in rage and grief. He was trying to speak, to answer, to confirm. He looked at Sarah, at her father's face in the photo, and then a clear, broken sentence forced its way out. "Sam tried to radio." He was saying her father, Samuel, tried to call for the abort. Robert's memory was returning, not as a flashback, but as a story he could finally tell. It was agonizing, but it was progress. He was communicating. And in that moment of profound vulnerability, as Robert sobbed and struggled to form more words, Mr. Green and his partner walked into the observation room. They had been monitoring the hospital's internal security feeds. They had heard everything. Mr. Green's face was stone. He looked at Dr. Evans. "You have just facilitated the discussion of classified information in an unsecured room with an uncleared civilian. This session is terminated. The patient is being transferred to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center immediately. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, given his active duty status at the time of the incident, his care is now a military matter." He turned to Sarah. "As for you, Ms. Bennett, your volunteer privileges are permanently revoked, and your father's service record is now under formal review for potential falsification related to unauthorized disclosures." The weapon they had hinted at was now unleashed. They were taking Robert away, and they were coming for her father's memory. As orderlies entered to prepare Robert for transfer, he became agitated, reaching for Sarah, a strangled cry in his throat. The 2 years of silence were over, replaced by a howl of protest against being taken from the only person who understood. Sarah watched, helpless, as the gurney was wheeled out, Robert's eyes locked on hers until the doors closed. She stood in the empty therapy room, the photograph of her father and Robert still in her hand. Dr. Evans was being served with a temporary suspension pending a federal review of his medical license. They had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and silenced. The truth had gotten Robert to speak, and in doing so, it had given the system the excuse it needed to bury him again, deeper this time. Sarah looked down at the smiling faces in the dusty photo. They had been betrayed twice, once in the desert and now in a hospital room. The battle for Robert's mind was over, but the war for the truth was just beginning. And Sarah Bennett, the rookie school teacher, was now the only civilian standing between 2 wounded Marines and the machine that wanted to erase them forever. Alone in the silent therapy room, Sarah Bennett made a decision. She would not run. She would not let them rewrite her father's life or bury Robert Miller in another kind of silence. She drove straight to the office of the newspaper reporter, the friend of Dr. Evans. His name was David Chen. She placed the grainy photograph on his desk and told him everything. The phrase, the ambush, the names Frank Donnelly had provided, the threat against her father's record, the sudden transfer of a vulnerable patient. David Chen listened, his initial skepticism melting into the focused intensity of a journalist who knows he's holding a live wire. "This is bigger than a human interest story," he said. "This is a potential war crime and a cover-up, but we need more than your word. We need documents. We need the official record of Operation Sandglass." "How do we get that?" Sarah asked. "We don't," David said, "but a United States senator can." David had a source on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, a staffer who was a notorious bulldog for accountability. He made a call. That evening, Sarah and David were in a nondescript office building in Washington, D.C., sitting across from Senator Eliza Vance's chief investigator, a woman named Mara. Sarah told her story again, this time with the methodical detail of a teacher laying out a lesson plan. Mara took notes, her expression unreadable. When Sarah finished, Mara closed her notebook. The DoD preemptively reviewing a veteran's service record after a family member stumbles upon classified information is not standard procedure. It's intimidation. The involuntary transfer of a catatonic veteran under treatment for security reasons is highly questionable. You've given us a thread. we'll pull it. The machinery of congressional oversight, once engaged, moves with a slow, grinding power. Senator Vance's office filed a formal inquiry with the Department of Defense and the VA, demanding Robert Miller's full medical and service records and the justification for his transfer. They invoked a little-known statute allowing for the review of classified operations if there is evidence of wrongdoing affecting veteran care. It was a legal shot across the bow. Meanwhile, David Chen began publishing. His first article was careful, focusing on the human mystery, a catatonic Marine, a teacher with a phrase, and a sudden government intervention in medical care. It didn't name Operation Sandglass or the alleged ambush. It simply asked questions. But in the world of veterans advocacy and military watchdog groups, those questions were dynamite. The story was picked up, shared, dissected. Online forums dedicated to special operations history lit up with speculation. The name JTF-7 began to appear in comments, sourced from anonymous accounts. The pressure had an immediate, paradoxical effect on Robert's new handlers at Walter Reed. Isolated in a secure wing, he was now a person of interest. The military psychiatrists assigned to him were top tier, but their mandate was ambiguous: treat the patient, but also assess what he knows. In this strange, pressurized environment, something unexpected happened. Robert, removed from the triggering environment of his old hospital and perhaps sensing the storm swirling around his story, began to stabilize. The catatonic rigidity lessened. He started to participate in basic occupational therapy. He still rarely spoke, but he would nod or shake his head. When shown a photo of Sarah by a sympathetic nurse, he pointed to it and said, clear as day, "Key." He was identifying her not as a threat, but as the catalyst. Back in Sarah's world, the threats materialized. A formal letter arrived from the Department of the Navy, stating that Master Sergeant Samuel Bennett's records were under review for anomalies regarding specific deployment dates. It was the promised attack on her father's legacy. Sarah's grief hardened into a furious resolve. She reached back out to Frank Donnelly. "They're going after my dad's name," she told him. "I need you to go on the record, not just for me, for all of you." Frank, seeing the fight actually being waged, found his courage. He agreed to give a full, on-the-record interview to David Chen with his lawyer present. He brought his own artifacts, a journal with coded entries from that period and a group photo identical to Sarah's. In a secure hotel room, Frank Donnelly told the full story of Operation Sandglass, the unauthorized convoy, the sighting of the weapon serial numbers, and the devastating ambush from a disguised friendly unit. He named the two military contractors. He stated under oath that the abort signal was deliberately withheld. His testimony was a bomb, ready to be printed. Senator Vance's investigation, now armed with Frank's public allegations, escalated. She called for a hearing. The DoD, now in a defensive public relations nightmare, was forced to respond. They declassified a heavily redacted summary of Operation Sandglass. It admitted to a joint logistics patrol that encountered unexpected hostile engagement, resulting in casualties. It made no mention of friendly fire contractors or withheld signals. It was a stonewall. But in bureaucracy, even a stone wall has cracks. The declassified document listed the participating units. One of them was a support battalion that had never been deployed to that region. It was a filler, a clerical error that exposed the lie. David Chen's next article headline screamed, "The Ghost Battalion, How a Paper Unit Exposes a Cover-Up." The confluence of media scrutiny and congressional pressure created an opening. Sarah, advised by Senator Vance's team, filed a formal petition with the Army Board for Correction of Military Records to stop the review of her father's file and to affirm his service. It was a direct, legal challenge. The hearing was set. Meanwhile, in a quiet office at Walter Reed, Robert Miller's treating psychiatrist, a colonel named Briggs, made a professional judgment. His patient was improving, but the core of his trauma, the betrayal, remained unaddressed and was being weaponized by outsiders. He believed Robert's best chance at full recovery was to confront the truth in a therapeutic setting, not have it used as a cudgel in a political fight. He reached out, unofficially, to Dr. Evans. A bridge was built between the military and civilian doctors. A month after his transfer, Robert Miller was granted a temporary leave to attend a joint therapeutic session at a neutral VA facility, under the supervision of both Colonel Briggs and the now reinstated Dr. Evans. Sarah was invited to attend. The meeting was tense, monitored by legal counsel from both the hospital and the DoD, but the focus was clinical. For the first time, Robert was in a room with two people who held pieces of his story. Sarah, who represented his lost brother-in-arms, and Dr. Evans, who represented his path back to the world. They didn't push him to name names or relive the ambush. They talked about trust. They talked about loss. And then Robert spoke. His voice was rough, unused, but the sentences were complete. "Sam Bennett was my friend," he said, looking at Sarah. "He told me he had a daughter. He showed me a picture. A school picture. He was proud." Sarah wept silently. Her father had never shown her that picture. He had never mentioned Robert, but he had carried them both. Robert continued, piecing his memory together like a mosaic. "The mission was wrong, we knew it. Sam said we had to report it. He tried to call it in. Then the shooting started from behind us." He clenched his fists. "I saw Sam go down. I saw the patches on the shooters, not insurgents, contractors. I knew them." He took a shuddering breath. "I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It was like my mind broke to protect the secret, but it wasn't my secret to keep." In that moment, Robert Miller didn't just describe his trauma, he reframed it. His catatonia wasn't just a collapse. It was a prison his own mind built to hold a truth he felt too powerless to tell. Sarah's phrase, "Watchtender's reprieve," hadn't just startled him awake. It had symbolically delivered the abort command that never came, signaling that it was finally safe to stand down from his solitary, internal watch. The session was a turning point. Colonel Briggs documented Robert's clear, coherent testimony as a therapeutic breakthrough, legally protected within the doctor-patient relationship. But the genie was out of the bottle. The details, while not officially recorded for an investigation, now lived in the room. Senator Vance's committee, informed of the progress, doubled down. They subpoenaed the two contractors named by Frank Donnelly and hinted at by Robert. Facing the specter of a public congressional hearing and the relentless press, one of the contractors, a man named Roland Voss, cut a deal. He agreed to provide documents to the Justice Department in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The documents were shipping manifests and encrypted communications that proved the unauthorized transfer of arms. They also contained a chilling line in a memo discussing the Sandglass personnel issue and recommending permanent operational closure. It was the smoking gun. The cover-up unraveled quickly after that. The other contractor fled the country. The military officers involved were quietly forced into retirement. With the core truth exposed, the government's stance softened. The review of Sarah's father's record was closed, his service honorably confirmed. More importantly, the Army issued a formal correction to the record of the Operation Sandglass engagement, acknowledging the friendly fire incident and the failure of command oversight. It was a dry, bureaucratic sentence that meant everything. It meant her father and Robert had told the truth. It meant they hadn't died or suffered for nothing. Robert Miller was discharged from Walter Reed and returned to the care of Dr. Evans at the original VA. He would never be the man he was before Sangin. He struggled with PTSD, with nightmares, with trust, but he was present. He spoke. He attended group therapy with other veterans. He began to paint messy, abstract canvases that his therapist said were a powerful form of nonverbal processing. And once a week, he had coffee with Sarah Bennett. They rarely talked about the past. They talked about her classroom, about his paintings, about ordinary things. They were a family forged not by blood, but by a shared, liberated secret. The final surprise came not from a document, but from a box. After the official records were corrected, Sarah received a package from the Army. It contained the personal effects of her father that had been logged after Operation Sandglass and had sat in storage for over a decade. Among the dog tags and the worn notebook was a single, folded piece of paper. It was a letter, unfinished, addressed to her. It read, My dear Sarah, if you're reading this, I didn't make it back. There are things I saw I can't talk about, but know this, I did my duty and I tried to do what was right. A man named Robert Miller is a good man. Remember that. I love you. He had written it before the mission, a habit he'd had. He had named Robert. He had, in his way, sent her a message 15 years into the future, a message that would eventually lead her to the very man who could confirm his honor. The circle was closed. The story of the catatonic Marine and the teacher's whisper faded from the headlines, replaced by the next scandal. But in the world of veteran mental health, it left a permanent mark. It sparked internal reviews about the VA's protocols for interacting with intelligence agencies. It led to new guidelines protecting therapeutic speech. And it became a case study, not just in trauma, but in the profound healing that can occur when someone from the outside, armed only with empathy and a fragment of shared truth, refuses to look away. Sarah Bennett still teaches 5th grade, but she also volunteers once a month at the VA, not as a companion, but as a speaker in a program that brings civilians and veterans together to share stories. She tells her story, not as a heroine, but as a daughter who found her father's legacy in the most unexpected place. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons, she visits Robert in the art studio the VA built. He'll show her a new painting, a swirl of dark colors cut through with a single bright streak of yellow. He'll nod at it and say, "That's the whisper." And they'll sit in a comfortable silence, the kind that is no longer empty but full of peace. The watch finally was stood down. So what do we make of a story like this? A miracle, a medical mystery, a conspiracy uncovered. Perhaps it's simpler and more profound. It is a story about the architecture of silence. The silence of trauma, which builds a fortress in the mind. The silence of institutions, which builds walls of classification and procedure. And the fragile, determined sound of a human voice that decides to speak into both. Robert Miller's journey reminds us that the most severe wounds of war are often invisible, etched into the nervous system, and that healing is not a straight line but a slow, painful excavation. Sarah Bennett's role shatters the myth that only experts can facilitate breakthrough. Sometimes it is the outsider, the civilian, the person carrying their own piece of the puzzle, who can, quite by accident, find the fitting edge. Her courage was not in knowing what she was doing, but in choosing to care after she had done it. This case exposed a dark friction between the military's need for operational secrecy and the medical community's imperative for therapeutic truth. It forced a conversation about where a veteran's right to heal ends and national security begins, a line that should never be so blurry. The bureaucratic victory, the corrected records, the acknowledged failure, is important, but the human victory is what echoes. A man who was lost to the world found his way back, not to fanfare, but to the quiet dignity of a canvas and a cup of coffee. A daughter reclaimed not just her father's honor, but the full weight of his story. Which leaves us with a lingering, uncomfortable question. Robert Miller was in a VA hospital, visible on a roster. What about the veterans who are not on any roster? The ones who disappear into the fabric of our cities, their silences unbroken, their stories unheard. And what about the secrets still kept, not for national security, but for institutional convenience? For every phrase whispered in a hospital room that unlocks a mind, how many more keys are lying forgotten in attics or buried in redacted files? The lesson here isn't that every catatonic patient needs a magic phrase. It's that every person trapped in the prison of their own past needs a connection that the past itself cannot corrupt. A connection that says, "I see you, your truth matters, and it is safe to come out now." That connection can be a therapist, a spouse, a fellow veteran. Or, as we've seen, it can be a school teacher who simply showed up and in a moment of helpless empathy offered the only piece of her heart that seemed relevant. These stories survive only if we choose to listen to them. They remind us of the cost of service that extends far beyond the battlefield and the collective responsibility we all share in the homecoming. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of bearing witness, then your engagement matters. Please subscribe to this channel. Not for me, but for the platform it creates. Every subscriber, every share, every comment signals that there is an audience for depth, for complexity, for the stories that honor the struggle without offering a cheap solution. It tells the algorithm that there is value in the quiet aftermath, not just the explosive battle. Help us tell more stories like Robert's and Sarah's. Help us ensure that the next time a whisper cuts through a silence, the world is ready to hear what comes after.